Hello, and welcome to a special online teach-in for media activism. My name is Paul George, and I'm the director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's program. We're pleased to be joined in this effort by our good friends at Peace Action of San Mateo County. If you live in that area, you should definitely check them out. Visit sanmataopeaceaction.org. And tonight's other co-sponsor is Roots Action Education Fund. Tonight's teach-in is one of many that Roots Action has initiated with activist groups around the country. Just one quick programming note. Following Norman Solomon's talk, he'll be glad to take your questions. We'll do this in two ways. You can ask your question directly by clicking on the raise hand icon. I'll explain that in a little more detail when we get to the Q&A. Or you can type your question by clicking on the Q&A icon. You can enter a question in the Q&A window at any time during the program. And now it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Norman Solomon this evening, something I've had the honor to do numerous times over the past 25 years or so. Norman is a journalist, author, media critic, activist, and former U.S. congressional candidate. Norman is the author of a dozen books, including his most recent, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. Norman is a longtime associate of the media watchdog group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, known as FAIR, and is the co-founder of Roots Action and the Institute for Public Accuracy. Norman has been immersed in anti-war, social justice, and environmental movements since the late 1960s. Please welcome Norman Solomon.
Hey, thanks, everybody. And I really want to say at the outset that what is necessary to turn back the momentum of the war machinery in this country requires a lot of grassroots organizing. And the messaging that we often get from the mass media is by omission or sometimes overtly that it isn't people who organize that change things from the bottom. It's the people in power who make their judicious decisions. And I want to emphasize that that kind of media messaging is completely counterproductive if we accept it. And that's why the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center and Peace Action of San Mateo County embody how change has always happened. When we look back at anything we can be proud of in this country, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's rights and gay rights movement, how through organizing people got the right to form unions, got Social Security and Medicare, and so much else that we now, unfortunately, often take for granted. It was never handed down from on high. It was always generated through organizing. My dear friend, Tim Carpenter from Progressive Democrats of America, who's no longer with us on the planet except in spirit, used to say that the spreadsheets never make it in the history books. And the day in and day out work that we do, although it's rarely acknowledged in the mass media, really add up to the engine that powers the social movements that create the change that's essential. Of course, now here we are in 2024, and we know that social movements that are now in existence in this country for progressive change are up against tremendous obstacles. And those obstacles often manifest through the mass media. I like to say that just because the mass media are a wall, it doesn't mean there aren't cracks. And just because there are cracks, it doesn't mean there isn't a wall. If you've ever organized, or for that matter, attended a demonstration, and I imagine those of us gathering here virtually tonight, the vast majority of us have, it's been a very frequent experience to be involved in an activity, an event, a protest, a picket line, a demonstration, a public activity of some sort. And then later on, we look around TV, radio, newspapers, and there's either no coverage whatsoever, or all too often the coverage is fragmentary, doesn't make a lot of sense, or maybe even is negative in terms of distorting what people were really about, what people were really trying to accomplish and were saying through the activities. There's a expression that says, whatever your first major issue is, your second concern should be media, because across the board, whatever the range of activities we have that are concerning us, often media outlets, the totality of the media in the country operate as barriers that are tough to get through, sometimes actually a powerful force against what we're trying to accomplish in terms of social change. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about a sort of a macro view of our situation right now in terms of media and politics here as we move into the spring of 2024. And then also, so to speak, some nuts and bolts factors of what we can engage with to create more cracks in the media walls, to generate the kind of understanding in the public that is, in the long run, very crucial. Of course, if we do actions and we call out for certain types of change and few people in the general public understand the issues, then we're not going to get very far. In the last 30 years, and I remember speaking at an event of the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center way back in the early 1990s in the wake of the Gulf War, the militarization of the United States has accelerated. The so-called Vietnam syndrome that was denounced by militarists has been largely overcome. And so we have a highly militarized society, and that's manifested by and accentuated through the mass media. And here in 2024, we have two huge wars that the United States is involved in. And the messaging coming from the mass media has been extremely important in what is possible to do on Capitol Hill and do through the legislative electoral process prospectively to turn this around. The assumptions, the code words, the catchphrases, the wording that we get that has been inculcated for so long, for decades, really, in memory. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In my book that Paul mentioned, War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, I have a first chapter that's titled Repetition and Omission, because the essence of propaganda is repetition, the code words, the catchphrases, the reinforcement of certain assumptions that are often the most powerful because they're equated with just common sense. And then there are the omissions. So, for instance, the repetition of phrases that unfortunately are even often internalized and reproduced by peace groups. The defense budget, defense spending. How often have you heard defense spending is too high? The defense budget is too high. Well, when we call it a defense budget, when we call it defense spending, we give away part of the argument right away. It's hard to convince people they shouldn't spend money on defending themselves. Here we have the United States, and this goes into the omission category, not totally taboo, not a censorship or law against pointing this out, but in our society with the First Amendment, I think it's Mark Twain who said, well, in the United States, we have freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the wisdom not to utilize either one. Of course, that's a bit hyperbolic, but here in the United States, we have a country that maintains at least 750 military bases overseas, a country that spends more on military, not on defense, on military than the next 10 countries combined, and most of those countries are US allies. So on the one hand, we have this repetition of the myth, lowercase d defense spending, which is now approaching just through the Pentagon, $1 trillion with a T dollars a year. And then we have the omission, the failure to point out that our purported enemy, Russia, has maybe 2 or 3 dozen military bases overseas. China might have 10 or 15. We have 750. But somehow the United States is the one trying to safeguard and defend the world from aggressive military forces who we're told are our enemies. The Ukraine war is one in which peace groups in the United States have been challenged in the last 2 years to have a single standard and a political understanding, a grasping of the need to be consistent about our principles, and also the need to pay attention to and talk about and acknowledge and discuss the meaning of actual history. Just because the United States is hypocritical in its condemnations of Russia, that doesn't mean that Russia has not been violating international law to kill large numbers of civilians and others in Ukraine. And so I think a consistent standard of human rights and of international behavior requires that we condemn something like what Russia is doing. When we have the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and President Biden talking about the need for what they call a rules-based order, that's a great example of the hypocrisy of the US that continues. And so this is the flip side. Just because the US is hypocritical, that doesn't justify what Russia is doing. And just because what Russia is doing is to be condemned, that doesn't mean it's okay for the US to be hypocritical. As a matter of fact, I think you can have a through line for the last many decades in which the United States has, as a government, in terms of foreign policy, pretty consistently stood for the violation of international law, consistently said, in effect, whatever the verbiage, we believe in a rules-based order, which means we make the rules and we break the rules. This is a manifestation of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism. And we're seeing that madness played out in a horrific way in Gaza, where now for almost 6 months, the United States government has not only verbally defended what Israel is doing to civilians in Gaza, not only vetoed 3 substantive ceasefire resolutions in the UN Security Council, but also shipped vast quantities of weapons to help the Israeli government slaughter civilians. And yet, this is controversial. The news media, which have at times portrayed the suffering inflicted by the Israeli government on civilians, we need to acknowledge that that kind of coverage is important, but still step back and look at the reality that, as I was saying earlier, the essence of propaganda is repetition and omission. And we keep hearing about how Israel has needed to defend itself. And what we don't hear much about is the fact that 80% of the weapons imports into the Israeli military have been coming from the United States. And we know that while there have been publicized 2 instances last winter where the Biden administration did an end run around Congress and sent weapons to Israel without congressional approval, we found out only 5 months into this war through a belated Washington Post report that the Biden administration had sent 100 different sizable shipments of weapons to Israel in secret. And we're left with this challenge in real time to confront the dire absence of democracy in this country, especially when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to military affairs. We've been taught, at least I learned in civics class that democracy requires the informed consent of the governed. And on these issues of war and peace, what we get from the US government and from mass media is not the informed consent of the governed, but the uninformed pseudo-consent of the governed, as much as it can be managed by those who are manufacturing consent, as Chomsky and Herman put it decades ago. That really segues, I think, to what we are up against and our opportunities as activists. I like to mention to folks sometimes when I talk about writing articles and writing books and so forth, I find it sometimes difficult, challenging to do that. I'm also an activist, and I find that activism is overall much more difficult. Activism is more difficult for so many reasons because the political culture, the mass media, the corporate media, including outlets like NPR and PBS, they don't recognize activism as significant, as important. They often are totally unwilling to even acknowledge it when it has become a major social force. And so as organizers, as activists, organizations such as Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, Peace Action of San Mateo County, and there are thousands across the country, different organizations that are working to turn around what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism. The obstacles are really great. Obviously, we have a small budget usually for our entire activities, and that is especially a challenge because of the importance of media. We know that sometimes when there's breaking news, all of a sudden media are perhaps more receptive to what we have to say, what we're doing, and so forth. But I like to compare peace activism to a train that needs to keep running all the time. And when you think about it, a train that is at a dead stop, it takes a lot of time and energy to get it rolling. Whereas at least if it is moving, even at a slow pace, then if there's an opportunity and a need and a capacity to accelerate, to really move forward, it's much easier to do. And so that's sort of a macro problem and a challenge for organizations to keep sustaining our groups ongoing, whether we are hitting a lot of bumps in the road or whether we're having some breakthroughs, and also to have, in effect, a media department. And whether it's a sort of a kitchen table activism, so to speak, or an organization, while we really have a shortage quite often of minimal financial resources and so forth, it's really very important to have an ongoing media operation. If we're a local or regional media organization, if we're a local or regional activist organization of any kind, we should know who is doing what in all kinds of media. And these days it's very, very complex: TV, radio, newspapers, podcasts, websites, on and on. We need to know who's doing what and how to reach them. And that's not really as easy as it sounds, because whether it's a daily paper, a weekly paper, radio stations, websites, or whatever, whether it's local, regional, or national, there's a revolving door. People are changing their assignments all the time. It doesn't help to send anything to somebody who's covering sports, even if they covered news last year, that kind of thing. So this can be labor intensive, but it's really a very important activity for people to be engaged in at an organizing level. Keep track of media and build those relationships with editors and reporters. Get to know them as much as possible. Don't assume that they're hostile. Maybe the management is not friendly. Maybe the top editors are politically reactionary or centrist or whatever, but there are a lot of reporters who might be actually sympathetic. So building that kind of rapport is really important. I started out by mentioning some of the frustrations we might feel when our events are either not covered or not covered well in the news department. And I do want to remind you not only of the importance of letters to the editor, but also opinion pieces. There is a default favorable receptivity, at least in theory, for a daily paper who has you in their circulation area, or that capacity for you to say, hey, I get your newspaper, I read what you're doing. And in almost a Gandhian way, just as we need to push for news coverage in ways that we think is appropriate, there also can be that approach to the editorial page. If they're running pieces of 600 or 700 or 800 words, they should seriously consider running a piece by you or people you work with on issues that you care about. And sometimes our persistence pays off and sometimes it doesn't. Whether it's TV, radio, newspapers, if our initial outreach is unsuccessful, either just generically or in response to specific events, then I really recommend doing some research on the coverage that they are accomplishing. The Media Watch Group Fair nationally has done that with outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. And it's a matter of doing content analysis. If the Mercury News is doing coverage of a certain issue, then it's not that hard, especially using the web, to analyze who their sources are. Who do they quote? Who is in their newspaper for a period of weeks or months? And the same applies to their op-ed page, their opinion section. If the daily paper or the weekly paper has run X number of articles that are opinion pieces on a certain subject, and there's a significant underrepresentation of people conveying our point of view, then that's an issue. And being able to document that is very important. And documenting it sometimes will get you somewhere. You can point out to the editor that this is a deficiency, that the gap between the rhetoric of saying we want to hear all points of view and the reality of not including certain points of view, that gap needs to be closed. Maybe that documentation will have an impact, maybe it won't. If it doesn't have an impact, then just as we sometimes ratchet up our pressure with an arms manufacturer or a congressperson, we also have the option to do that with a TV station, a radio station, a newspaper. Make the case, document the concern. We don't get acceptable response. Getting out the picket signs, call a picket line, have a rally, have a protest, have a vigil. Why is this important? Well, I think it's fairly apparent, but sometimes it's hidden in plain sight. If we can't bring about a situation with the informed consent of the governed, then it's much more difficult to bring about social change. And I'll sort of close on this point. The same applies with members of Congress. We've been acculturated, often through news media, to be so grateful when a member of the House or the Senate does some things that we're pleased with, that when we don't get a satisfactory response from members of Congress, and that's certainly usually the case on issues of the failure to call strongly for a Gaza ceasefire, for instance, then we need to ratchet up the pressure. We need to be willing to do that. It's not about making our group popular. It's about building pressure on that congressperson to call for the changes that we know are really essential. So with that, thanks again for the hosting of this event and for joining us online this evening. And I'll look forward to questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Norman. And we really encourage everyone to get involved in this conversation by coming up with a question. We talked about this before coming on, and Norman wanted to give a lot of time to your questions. So let's get to it. First of all, I want to introduce from Peace Action of San Mateo County, Ron Zucker. And maybe we can bring Ron on here. Ron, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here with you guys. Thank you, Norman, and thank you, Paul, for helping put this together with us, or maybe we're helping putting this together with you. But however it works,
It's been a fun process and an important one too. And it's important for groups like ours to work together as often as we can to collaborate. There's strength in numbers, as they say, and that's very true in grassroots activism. So folks, here's how the Q&A works. First, you can type a question in by clicking on the little Q&A icon there. And Ron is going to look over, sort through those and read off the best questions that are in the Q&A. If you want to ask your question directly, click on the raise hand icon. And when you do that and I call on you, you'll see a little pop-up box come up on your screen saying the director has asked you to unmute. And you have to unmute yourself. We can't turn your microphone on. Only the National Security Agency is allowed to do that. We can't do it. We can turn you off, though, if you aren't asking a question. So I don't see any questions yet. So let me ask my own question to get us started here, and hopefully we'll get some hands raised or some questions typed into the box. Norman, California has a new, what's the law called? A media awareness? The for high school students, media literacy.
Yeah.
Media literacy law. Have you followed that much? What do you think of that?
No, I haven't. About the California law, media literacy has been sort of a phrase, very popular one, for decades. And of course, it can mean many things to many different people.
That's true. And I saw one article recently in the Mercury News tracking a local high school journalism teacher. And he seems to have a pretty good plan to teach his students some media literacy, how to read between the lines, some of what you were just talking about. And we hope to be doing a program with him and some of his students.
Yeah,
So we've got
I really
some hands up
recommend.
here.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Salam Ajluni. And if you unmute yourself and then just ask your question. Go ahead, Salam.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I was typing in my question. I didn't know I'd raised my hand. I'm sorry. But I was just wanted to ask Norman Solomon about how he evaluates the relative value and efficacy of alternative media in getting the message out to large numbers of people versus legacy or traditional media. And is it an end run? Is it a way around the gatekeeping capacities of media? And you can mute me now.
Yeah, thanks. That's a key question, and I think it's one that has challenged people for quite a while. There was, I remember, a lot of discourse about should we be building our own alternative media outlets, or should we be concentrating on trying to get into mainstream media and challenging those, as you say, what are called legacy outlets. I really think it's all the above. It can't be necessarily all the above for an organization or an individual, because we have to concentrate quite often and really be specific to focus our energies. We don't have resources or time often to do all the above. But really, in terms of social dynamics, we cannot leave any media stone unturned. We must build our own alternative outlets. I mean, in a way, we're talking through one right now. Organizations that are activists, creating our own means of communication. We know that millions of people are reached every day in the United States by progressive outlets, and those outlets have really grown in strength. And everybody listening to us talk right now, no doubt has their own. I mean, I go to Common Dreams every day. There's Democracy Now!, there's Truth Out, there's TruthDig, there's antiwar.com. There are many, many others that are in aggregate truly reaching substantial numbers of people. And those outlets really need to be supported. At the same time, we can't let mainstream media off the hook. And a spectrum from Fox News to the New York Times and Washington Post, which is basically to the right wing through liberal media outlets, all of those need to be challenged. And there's sort of, so to speak, carrots and sticks. Occasionally, we will find terrific op-ed articles in the New York Times or Washington Post. I say only occasionally. Sometimes there's news articles that we would consider well done, but a lot of it's pretty terrible stuff. And on issues of war and peace, really usually reinforce the assumptions for U.S. global empire and all that comes with it. I've been working as a faraway associate at times with the Media Watch Group FAIR for several decades now. And I really recommend everybody to go to fair.org, take a look at what they're doing in terms of media criticism and activism, because they go hand in hand to criticize and analyze corporate media, and also to find ways to challenge the media directly and indirectly, putting pressure on them. As I mentioned earlier, the picket lines, deluging them with calls, meetings, all the rest of that. So I think we have a lot of those alternatives. And one final note at this juncture from me is that I was talking with somebody at the New York Times who said, you have no idea how many people in the New York Times newsroom look at progressive websites. They're looking for ideas. It doesn't mean those ideas will necessarily get through into the Times, but we're having an effect. And so we really need to have, pardon the sports analogy, a full court press at all times to really use absolutely every avenue we can. Back to that metaphor of the wall and the cracks. There are the cracks in the walls. We need to create a lot more of them, and we need to find ways to message through them in ways that help to build social movements.
Thank you for that. Ron, you have something in the Q&A window?
I do. I've got two very similar questions, actually. I'm going to try to make them one, and because they really, and then there's a third one after that, but we'll start with these two. These come from Wendy Greenfield and Dora Rosen, and it's, how do you suggest cultivating a relationship with reporters and editors to, among other things, express concerns about their coverage or to get more coverage for underreported sides of specific issues? Do you suggest scheduling a meeting with them or writing to them? What do you think?
The local folks, it becomes more possible or practical to have meetings and to request them. And a lot of that really depends on the specific dynamics. For instance, some, and I'm not one of them, but some people love to direct message through social media. There are quite a lot of reporters who use Twitter in that way, among other ways. And so going through the process of researching where people are they people who are editors and reporters? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? A lot of this is done through email, and usually, not always, but for the most part, it's feasible to reach editors and reporters via email. And they like that because it's on their own schedule. They don't feel intruded on or interrupted by deadline. I definitely think it's appropriate to suggest a meeting. And as always, being polite really makes sense, but it doesn't mean we need to be overly deferential. We should be very assertive. And ostensibly, these are journalists who are after, if not the truth per se, then at least providing a range of perspectives to come through their media outlets. So I think that sort of outreach, whether phone, email, Twitter, Facebook, old-fashioned snail mail, all the above can really work. And the personalities are going to vary. Some of those reporters are just rude and arrogant. Some of them are terrific, receptive, and there's a lot in between. And that's where the individual relationships can really pay off.
Thank you, Wendy and Dora, for two excellent and quite practical questions. Okay, I see Mike Cajano has his hand up, and while he gets unmuted, I'll mention that Mike Cajano is president of Peace Action of San Mateo County. Mike, your question.
Delusions of grandeur. Okay. No, the one I noticed, one of my heroes is like the Code Pink organization. They create their own media with performance media, I guess you would call it. And I imagine there's a fine line. Like I like the idea of laying down in front of Nancy Pelosi's car in front of her house. Some of them actually put red paint on her door. I mean, but this seems like you've got to really be careful where you might cross the line and become counterproductive, and people will say, "Oh, poor Nancy Pelosi is being harassed by the Code Pink crazy people." But the fact remains, they've been always very, very successful at being right behind the camera in a lot of these hearings in Congress. And there's, I'm sure they know her by sight as the head of Code Pink, and she's right there. And at the right time, she'll pick up a placard and get thrown out and what have you. It just strikes me as that's something that's quite a skill. And I just wonder what you might think about that. But they seem to excel at it, and some people try it, and some are miserable failures. But I thought I'd like to hear what you thought about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think of a garden where you need a lot in the garden. If you just had trees or shrubs or ground cover, it's not going to work. And I think effective social movements and messaging through all kinds of media really requires that we have this vast array of activities. Everything from writing to Congress people, letters to the editor, to picket lines, to civil disobedience, to vigils, to right now there's a series of, I think it's 22-mile vigil marches around the country calling for a ceasefire. So many different things that can be done, including what you're referring to, Mike. And I think the precept of remaining nonviolent is really important if for only the reason that violence is going to be counterproductive. The Pentagon excels at violence. We're talking their language, and you're never going to be able to defeat the capacity of the state that way, I believe. We have a set of opportunities, and the more creativity, the better.
Okay, back to Ron and the Q&A window. What have we got,
Okay.
Ron?
This comes from Wendy Feng. I'll read probably part of this, not all of it, but it says, "Hi, I'm new to SMPA, that's Peace Active San Mateo County, and we're grateful for this program, and we welcome you, Wendy. So following on the very first question, wondering if folks have heard of Nostr, Nostr. I have not heard of it, but it's a decentralized social media. Talking about a new friend, a friend of hers from Puerto Rico who introduced her to this, and it talks about other things, Bitcoin and things like that being done in El Salvador, saying MLK Jr. found militarism, racism, and economic exploitation to be intertwined. So I think the main point of her question is, how do we dismantle the financial engine running the war machine? I hope I got that right.
Organizing is the easy answer because it's so easier said than done. It's a 24/7, 365 activity. The core of profit from war is just central to what we're up against. There used to be a saying during the Vietnam War, war is profitable, invest your son. Now, more and more with air wars, aerospace is a lot of where the cash cow for militarism is. War is profitable, invest in Raytheon or Northrop Grumman. We have this insanity of massive military budget, which is profiteering. And this is an example of omission, as I was referring to earlier, that we need to inject into the public discourse every way we can our terminology, which would be, for instance, war profiteering. I mean, during World War II, Harry Truman became well known as a senator because he chaired hearings against war profiteering. Now we hear that phrase very rarely. The sort of liberal response is, oh yeah, we should have good auditing. Well, yeah, we should have good auditing at the Pentagon, but we don't want a well-audited war machine. We don't want a culture of death to have balance sheets that balance out. So it's a challenge for us to, yes, incorporate, we want financial responsibility, but also go to the point that we're talking about a different kind of foreign policy. And I think as the question alludes to, that means a different kind of economic system. And obviously that is huge. It's humongous. It's the war machine is propelled by the drive for profits. And that very reality is rarely alluded to in the mass media. It's one of the points we need to make. I mentioned Northrop Grumman, and that gives me a chance to very briefly mention that intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, have 400 hair trigger alert silos in 5 states. They are the most dangerous weapons, according to, former Defense Secretary William Perry. Daniel Ellsberg, in his book, The Doomsday Machine, stresses that the single most important thing we could do to reduce the chance of nuclear war is to shut down ICBMs. Why? Because they're the part of the triad that is on hair trigger alert. The president has some time to decide whether a report of incoming missiles really is about incoming geese. If the issue is whether to use sea-based nuclear missiles or air-based, because they are not vulnerable to attack. But land-based missiles, the ICBMs, are. And that's why they're on hair trigger alert. And that's why there's just a few minutes for a president to decide whether to launch them, use them or lose them problem. So what I'm getting to is that, as per Daniel Ellsberg's emphasis and analysis, the Roots Action Education Fund, as part of the Diffuse Nuclear War campaign, is organizing with others around the country for what we're calling Daniel Ellsberg Week. So this is a specific suggestion that people on this call consider. You can participate in Daniel Ellsberg Week. It's coming up June 10th to 16th. There are details on it when you go to the Diffuse Nuclear War website, which is simply diffusenuclearwar.org. And there's so many things that can be done. I'll just very briefly tell you that when we were distributing Daniel Ellsberg's last book on Capitol Hill, we brought specific letters, dear Congresswoman Eshoo, dear Senator Wyden, 535 of them signed by Daniel Ellsberg. Here's my book. ICBMs are the biggest danger of nuclear war. And we would bring the book to the front desk in Capitol at different offices. And quite often the people behind the desk, I would say, oh, well, here's a book and a letter for the congressman. And it's a letter from Daniel Ellsberg. And often the person behind the desk would say, oh, I'm not familiar with that name. Who's Daniel Ellsberg? Now, these are people working in the US Congress in 2018. And so one of the many activities that is coming up June 10th to 16th that anybody can do, and we have resources, we have a sample proclamation that your city council or board of supervisors can adopt, proclaiming Daniel Ellsberg Week, but also we have a template for going to your city council, county commission, state legislature, or whoever. Let's name this street Daniel Ellsberg Street. Let's name this library Daniel Ellsberg Library. Let's name this elementary school or high school Daniel Ellsberg High School. And you can see the connection. If people don't even know, the younger generation doesn't even know who Daniel Ellsberg is, then raising these issues gives us an opportunity to bring not only his name, but the history of the Pentagon Papers and his 52 years of fight against militarism to the fore and to the public. So I just want to put that out as an invitation.
Thank you for that. I think we might take you up on some of that for Daniel Ellsberg Week.
Right.
I wanted to ask again if that social media called Noster rings a bell at all.
Not for me, no.
Okay.
But it in a way it's good that it's not familiar, because there's so many flowers blooming right now online and so much creative work being done by so many progressives.
I'll mention at this point that one of the things that Peninsula Peace and Justice Center likes to do with our webinars, we send out a follow-up email with links for further reading and link to the video. The video of this program will be online. So I'll look into Noster. I just made a note about that, and if there's anything there, we'll pass that along in the follow-up email. Before I jump to the next hand raised, I wanted to just share an anecdote that conveys about the power of activists using media to try to get their word out. Especially back in 2002, 2003, the big run up to the Gulf War, local news stations were quite interested in covering local protests and stuff. So we started organizing rallies at the time of the live broadcasts on the local news. And they would show up and they'd do a live cut from our rally. Invariably, after this would happen, we would get phone calls or people would show up at the rally later on. And they said, I was sitting at home thinking I was the only person who felt this way, but I saw you on TV and thank you for being here. And they start showing up. And I just thought I'd pass that along as emphasis on how important this media work is. So Donald Smith has his hand up. So if we can get him online here. Donald, what's your question?
Hi, I'm Norman. So you mentioned the great publications like Common Dreams, Truth Out. Even The Nation has, and even the New York Times occasionally has excellent stuff too. So my question is, how to get, even if I try to share that on social media, the people don't want to read what they're not interested in reading. So my point is, we already have these great stuff about anti-war stuff, but we have to get it in front of people's eyes locally, like on social media or into groups. So how can we like build the local infrastructure that connects the local with the statewide? I guess that's my question. Because anyway, so traditional media is dying. So I do think we need to work more on building local media that we control. But anyway, those two questions about how to get the great content that's out there is sort of just in our bubble, and we don't need new publications to publish that unless they just copying what's national. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that sorry, I've got something in my throat. I think that we have an opportunity to amplify what is out there, and I think you're referring to that. That there are many things that can be done that could amplify what is there. Common Dreams is a great example. It's often reposted, and that's one of the avenues. So I do think that creating our own media locally is very important. And so if we have a capacity to generate local news that deals with issues we're concerned about, that is a very important option. And one example, there are weapons manufacturers all over this country, and they often have offices that are kind of inconspicuous. And we, through local media, can do something that we can't get from national media. And so that's where our local infrastructure, newsletters, websites, social media networks have a lot of opportunity to fill in a gap. I mean, let's face it, our daily newspapers are often pathetic. I mean, a lot of it's just by omission. They're not covering local news, and the quantity of coverage is going downhill, and the quality was usually not great to begin with. So I think in a way we could differentiate between the need for us to build news and analysis and opinions that intersect with issues that are at least locally, intersecting locally. What's the local congressperson doing? Where are the local arms manufacturer offices, for instance? Gee, Silicon Valley, I mean, it's up to its neck in the military-industrial complex. I mean, you could do, it could be full-time 100 people covering the way in which Silicon Valley is enmeshed with the war machine. That's an example of that intersection. But that said, and I think I'm understanding your point correctly, that outlets like, just to take Common Dreams for example, or Democracy Now!, as widely as they are reaching people, they really need help. They have a limited budget. And social media is still in existence, still very important, so we could amplify and circulate that way. But we could also innovate in other ways to form partnerships with national outlets that we think are good. One more thing, one one reason I talk a lot about Common Dreams is they don't have a paywall. And it's unfortunately an obstacle that we face with a lot of websites that we need to get around quite often.
I want to chime in and second Norman on Common Dreams. It's commondreams.org, I believe. The other big advantage of Common Dreams is that just about everything they publish there, they publish with a Creative Commons license, which means I can freely republish that on the Peace and Justice Center's website. And it's a great way to expand, to multiply what they're doing there. There's a couple other sites like The Conversation, and a lot of ProPublica's fine journalistic work is also published with a Creative Commons license. It means anybody's free to put it up on their website. It's a terrific resource. Before I throw this back to Ron for the next written question, I will point out to our listeners that there are no hands up. So this is a good time to get your hand up and get in my line. And meanwhile, we'll go back to Ron with what he's got in the Q&A window.
Okay, the next question is from Lisa Evans. It's about kind of an admirable effort that she engaged in, of which I was aware. Says, she sent emails last fall to the Redwood City mayor and members of the Redwood City Council inviting the mayor to join Mayors for Peace, which is kind of a local initiative for making statements against nuclear weapons. She says, I pointed out in my letter that the $90 billion budget in 2023 for our nuclear weapons program is money not spent on those local needs. She says she received no response from anyone, and is there any more that she can do to get this issue addressed?
Absolutely, such an important question. People run into that a lot. Public officials, they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to look bad in public, and it is our responsibility or opportunity, if they are not responsive, to make them look bad, not gratuitously, but because that's only fair. And there are surveys showing that often, whether it's a daily or weekly paper, the most read item is the letters to the editor. And it's quite feasible to write a letter to the local daily, the local weekly, the regional daily or weekly, and just say, I wrote to the mayor, I said thus and so, I never even got a response. And that's a totally legitimate thing to do. And if you're really exercised about it and you think it's a big issue, buy the paint and poster board and maybe get some friends to go out and set up a picket line and do a news release about the picket line.
Excellent suggestions. Okay, we do have another hand up. This time it's Wendy. So if we'll get Wendy on here, what's your question?
Hi, thank you so much. So I had previously asked the question about the financial engine as well, and I'm hearing a lot about organizing. So thank you for bringing up that 22-mile march. I went to it yesterday. It was in the East Bay,
Right.
22 miles symbolizing northern Gaza to Rafah, and very, very powerful being among different faith organizations. I'm wondering, since I'm new to this organization, how often are there in-person meetings, about how many people attend? How can I get involved to meet more of the community? Thank you.
That sounds like that's for you, Ron. Unmute, Ron.
Tried clicking once, and I think if you will connect up with us through through our email, which is smpa@sanmataopeaceaction.org, and give us your ideas and your initiatives and so forth, and we can certainly, help get you plugged in, and we can always use new input from whoever's out there, and we can use your ideas. And I
Okay.
think this message is I mean, this question is kind of about messaging to some degree. The question is from Lorraine Hancock, says, wouldn't it be more appropriate to demonstrate with signs saying not necessarily ceasefire. And of course, he's talking about the situation in Israel and Gaza, but instead of ceasefire with signs saying stop sending bombs, stop sending guns, stop paying to kill. And I think like I say, the emphasis here is on how can we message this.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, we have a lot of options and a lot of messages that I think are simultaneous, and they all make sense. I mean, right now the bombs are falling, and if the pipeline is cut off, Israel can still be bombing for presumably weeks. So it all makes sense. I think that is a good point too. We want to cut off the flow of weapons and at the same time say that every day that goes by with more slaughter of civilians is intolerable. I think that we've seen in the last years the results of organizing. It's never fast enough. 10, 20 years ago, advocating for Palestinian human rights was much more difficult to get through the mass media. Now, because of the organizing and infrastructure, what so many people have done as individuals and as organizations, when this terrible crisis and war had broken out, we at least have been in a better position to move forward and create movements that can push back against the war machine. Before we say goodbye for now, I wanted to mention that we have a website that could address this question of reaching out and amplifying articles. It's called Progressive Hub. That's at progressivehub.net, and Roots Action launched it about 2 years ago. Most of the articles on there are reposting from places like Common Dreams and so forth, but more and more we're getting articles from people who write them and send them to Progressive Hub. And we would solicit any articles for progressive information and analysis from people on this call. And that's a way to reach out. And sometimes we syndicate from there. So please do go, if you're interested, to progressivehub.net. And you can always reach the editors at progressivehub.net. It's simply another way to share information and analysis and to help organize.
Sounds like an excellent resource, and we'll include that also, a link to that in the follow-up email. Norman, it's been wonderful working with you again. It's good we're not in the same room, but maybe we'll get there sooner or later. Any final thoughts or closing remark you'd like to make before we thank people for coming?
Well, I'd like to reiterate that just like this event tonight, nothing happens without organizing, people putting in the time and the energy and first imagining, creating, following through. And so this is sort of an unsolicited plug. Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, Peace Action of San Mateo County. These are two organizations that are part of a far-flung infrastructure. God knows we're not perfect. None of us are. We all have feet of clay at certain moments. I certainly do as individual, as organizations. We're all questing to turn around the momentum of this country. We have a fascist Republican Party. We have a militaristic two-party system. We know so much work to do. And so I think I'll just close on the note that we have many reasons to be discouraged. I often think of something that Antonio Gramsci wrote. He was in prison under Mussolini, and he talked of the need for pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And we certainly have a lot of reasons for pessimism, but our optimism of the will can make a huge difference.
Okay, and with that, I will give a big thank you to Peace Action of San Mateo County for participating and helping with this, and thanks to Ron Zucker. Also, thank you to David Simon, who has been madly clicking things behind the scenes and keeping this looking good for us. And thank you all for attending. We had a very good turnout tonight, and we're very appreciative of that. Norman Solomon, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and maybe we can get together again sometime soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.